We have talked a little bit about crime and punishment in the 18th century, and I'd like to move on and talk about it in the Victorian period. But let's first of all go back to the sort of history of what we've said before. If you were in my class last term, some of this was said last term. We were looking at the 16th and 17th centuries, you see. So at that time, especially in the 17th century, there wasn't much sense of some crimes being more serious than others. So if you do a bad thing, it's a bad thing. It doesn't matter how big or small it is. We talked a bit about this before. You remember I said you could be hanged for a sheep or a lamb in the 18th century. So if you were convicted of a crime, the two typical punishments were that you would either get pardoned and be set free, or you'd just be hanged. And prison in itself wasn't considered a punishment. It was just a place where people waited to be punished. And we looked at Moll Flanders, if you remember, when we were talking about the 18th century. This is actually set in the 17th century, although the story is an 18th century story. It was written in the 18th century. And as we saw, Moll herself is a thief, and she gets put in prison. This is just sort of reminding you of things that we said before, okay? So nothing particularly new here. She gets saved, not quite so dramatically as it happens in the movie. She's rescued. She's not actually put to death, and she is sent to one of the colonies, which was a typical punishment in those days, sending people to the colonies as a convict. The word, this word convict is, it means somebody who's been declared a criminal, a convict, but it was particularly used for people who'd been sent out to America in the 17th and early 18th centuries, or to Australia, or to other colonies later on in the time of the empire. And yeah, men, women, and children, okay, publicly being put to death. All of this is something we talked about before, so I'm just kind of reminding you. To talk about the death penalty in a little bit more detail, there were, at the time of the beginning of our period, there were hundreds of crimes for which you could be put to death. Mandatory. It was a mandatory punishment. Mandatory means there is no other punishment. The judge can't say, oh, well, in this case, we won't put you to death. It was mandatory, meaning it had to be. The judge couldn't choose a different penalty. You had to be put to death for those 222 crimes. Although getting a reprieve or a pardon was becoming more and more common, because people thought, well, it's just too much to put somebody to death for a small thing. If you kept friends with gypsies, you could be put to death. If you damaged cows, you could be put to death. If you damaged Westminster Bridge, I don't know why a special penalty for Westminster Bridge and not other bridges, but Westminster Bridge in London, if you damage that one, you'll be put to death. If you're going to damage a bridge, go and damage a different one, because that one, they'll put you to death. I don't know why they put you to death for that particular bridge. Pretending to be a Chelsea pensioner. Chelsea pensioners are, they have a special sort of honour, and they wear a special kind of uniform. They're respectable old people. If you pretended to be one, you could be put to death. Even young children, if they showed strong evidence of malice, if a child from the age of 7 to 14 showed that they were strongly kind of ijiwaru, they could just put them to death. They said, this child is very definitely ijiwaru. They could just put them to death for it. Stealing from a shipwreck. This is a particularly nasty crime, actually, stealing from a shipwreck. It might sound harmless, but it was a kind of hobby in some parts of England, where they had rocks close to the shore to put out lights for the ships. And the ships would come in and hit the rocks. And it was on purpose, it was wazato. Okay? The people from that area would get extra riches by killing the people on the ship, because when the ship hit the rocks, everybody on the ship would die. So I think that one's reasonable enough, actually, stealing from a shipwreck in those circumstances, because very often they would bring the ship onto the rocks purposely so that the people on the ship would die, and then they'd steal all the goods from the ship, and that would be the way that they made their living. Poaching was stealing animals, going into the forest, for example, and killing a rabbit or something like that. If you were a soldier or a sailor and you didn't have your license, if you wrote a letter threatening anybody, if you destroyed certain roads, the turnpike roads were roads where you had to pay a toll. You had to pay, you know, just like you pay to go on the Kosokudoro in Japan these days, you had to pay to go on certain roads. If you damaged them, you would be put to death. Stealing from a rabbit warren, pickpocketing. Taking something from somebody's pocket. Being out at night with a blackened face, because a blackened face would suggest that you were, you'd made your face black so that people couldn't easily see you in the dark. Why did you go out at night with your face black? You went out to steal, you went out to rob. So even if you hadn't stolen anything or you hadn't robbed anything, you were just going to. Okay? Because you got a blackened face, they'd have put you to death in those days. And yet, during our period, during the Victorian period, most of this is going to change. Nearly all of these will get wiped out in the 19th century. They will no longer be punishable by death. And that's something generally we need to think about with the 19th century. It's a time of huge reform in all sorts of ways. So please, when you are writing a novel, you're writing about a novel from the 19th century, please be very careful to think, when exactly was this novel published? People will say, oh, in Victorian England, you could be put to death for many crimes. At the beginning, yes, but not at the end. People say, oh, in Victorian England, women had no rights. At the beginning, yes, but not by the end. Oh, in Victorian England, nanika, nanika. Please check carefully the year, because it changes. The Victorian period is a time of huge social change. And this is just one of them, the changes that we see in the law. Okay, I'll pick that one out. A particular example, strong evidence of malice in young children. It looks worse than it was. It didn't normally get carried out. They would use it to frighten children. They'd put them in prison and say, you are ijiwaru, you're going to be put to death. And then they'd say, ahahaha, konkai daijoubu desu kedo, kore kara kiotsukete. Okay? So they would typically use this as a threat rather than something they would actually do. But there were times when they did do it. An 11-year-old girl in the 16th century was hanged. We don't know what she did. In the 17th century, a 9-year-old boy started a fire, and they put him to death for starting a fire. In the 18th century, a 16-year-old girl was burned for murdering her mistress. Burning women was something that continued long after they stopped burning men. Might seem strange. Why did they stopped burning men? Because they stopped having the crime that men were burned for. The crime that you got burned for was heresy. Does anybody remember what heresy was? What that crime was? It's going against the teaching of the church. And the penalty for heresy was burning. And the crime of heresy was changed basically in the time of Queen Elizabeth. she said, there's no more heresy. The crime of heresy becomes treason. We put heresy together with treason. Treason equals being a traitor or betraying your country, being a uragirimono to your country. And one of the ways of being a traitor was through your religion, because Catholics wanted to have a Catholic leader for the country. So you can be a Catholic, but don't try to change the rule of the country. So the penalty for heresy was burning. Okay, heresy, burning. And the penalty for treason was hanging, hanging plus. Let's call it hanging plus. It was a horrible punishment because they would hang the person, and while they were still alive, they would take them down and cut their body open and take out the insides of their body. Pretty horrible. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't want to make you sick on a beautiful morning, but it was a very nasty penalty. And that was considered too severe for women. So hanging for men and still burning for women. Okay? Because it was considered that hanging was too, that type of hanging, hanging, drawing and quartering, which was more than just hanging, it was a very painful and cruel death, was too severe for women. So the original reason why women were still being burned in the 18th century was because when they changed from heresy to treason, it was considered too cruel to punish women in that way. By the 18th century, it's starting to look strange because women are being burned. In this case, she's being burned for murdering her mistress, but they said that it's not just murdering your mistress. Your mistress is an important person in the country. You've gone against your country. You are betraying your country by burning, by murdering your mistress in this case. And another girl set fire to a haystack again in the 18th century. Are you okay there? Is there a question there? So, you all right? Okay. Okay. Ask me afterwards if you're not sure, all right? So occasionally it happened, but mostly children were not put to death for these kinds of crimes. They usually got a reprieve, a pardon. And then again, though, right at the end of the 18th century, 1794, a 15-year-old girl killed her grandfather, and again she was put to death. But this question of burning, what they did, they said, okay, it seems like it's too cruel to hang, draw, and quarter women, so we'll burn them instead. And then somebody said, well, burning's not exactly pleasant. Can we give them a quick death? So what they actually did was they would hang them first, and then they would burn the body after the person was dead. All very unpleasant. And yes, it sounds horrible, but burning was supposed to be kinder than the punishment that men would get for these crimes. Men were hanged, as I say, hanged, drawn, and quartered meant that they were hanged, cut down while they were still alive, and then they were cut out. They did nasty things to them. It's probably better not to think about it. And that punishment was last carried out in 1782. So they are starting to think that some punishments are just too cruel. Hidosugiru. In the late 17th century, there was something called the Bill of Rights, was passed. Bill of Rights. And it contained, for the first time, I can't remember the exact date offhand, it's this late 17th century. And it's got the words cruel and unusual punishment. The first time that these words were used, these words came back. They were used in American law. Those words became quite famous. Cruel and unusual punishment should not be allowed. The government should not punish people in ways that are cruel and unusual. And slowly, people started to feel that killing people in cruel ways was wrong. If you're going to do it, just do it as quickly as possible. Don't make it into a form of torture. Well, it would never be pleasant, but... So let's look at this way in which the 19th century starts to reform the death penalty. We've got 35,000 people being sentenced to death over a 60-year period. The last 30 years of the 18th century and the first 30 years of the 19th century. 35,000 Satman Gosengni. Most of them got pardons. Again, 80% got pardoned or reprieved in some way. And 20% were actually hanged. As the 19th century continued, the number of crimes that you could be put to death for was cut down again and again and again all through the century. They cut down on, you can't be hanged for that crime, you can't be hanged for that crime. So they starting to have the idea of the punishment should suit the crime, that the punishment should be in the same proportion to the crime. So if it's a small crime, a small punishment. If it's a big crime, a big punishment. Before, it was more like any crime, and you could be put to death for it. By the 1860s, the only crimes that you could be put to death for were murder, treason, piracy, and arson. Arson means starting a fire. And even then, only if you started a fire in the ports, in the naval dockyards, where huge amounts of food, huge amounts of produce were stored. If you tried to destroy those large, important supplies for the country, you could still be put to death. But otherwise, murder is killing another person, so obviously they felt that you should be killed yourself if you did that. Treason is betraying your country, so many people could lose their lives if you betray your country. Being a pirate was a particularly punishable crime. All through history, they didn't like people who went out onto the sea and stole from other people's ships, because again, you're breaking down the bye-bye community, kind of society that's built on buying and selling and trading. Britain was a trading empire. So pirates were undermining that, making the situation unstable. When people took their ship out onto the sea, pirates would come and take their goods, and quite often kill people at the same time. So those were the only crimes by the middle of the 19th century that were punishable by death. But it's worth noticing that these punishments were carried out in public. In 1824, a man called Henry Fauntleroy, who was a high-class gentleman, attracted thousands and thousands of people, 100,000 people, a huge crowd of people flocked to see this high-class gentleman being hanged. It was partly because of his social class that they wanted to see this. The newspapers, the broadsheets would publish all the details. Very often in a kind of excited, scandalous kind of way, and they talk about, you know, his face before he died, and did he say anything before he died, and perhaps I shouldn't go into too much detail because it is rather nasty. Did his neck break or did he suffocate? Things like that, okay? Very unpleasant, really. And then by the 1850s, there were special trains that would take people to the executions. So they put on extra trains knowing that a lot of people would want to go and see it. So we've still got that kind of idea of suffering as entertainment, almost. I mean, why did people, I don't know why people went. Did they go just for fun? Did they go because they wanted to see a bad person get punished? Well, I don't know why they went. But it was a popular attraction. Alcohol was a big part of these events. They'd be selling alcohol publicly. People would be getting drunk in the street. And sometimes it was even dangerous. One execution in Newgate in London, which was a place where many of the executions took place, 27 people were trampled to death. Some kind of panic in the crowd, people running, panicking, I don't know why, and people who fell down were just trampled and killed. And by 1868, public feeling had changed. Again, it's one of those things where you would have to say, which part of the 19th century are we talking about? If it's the late 19th century, no, people were not going and seeing executions taking place in public. That ended in the 1860s. But before that, yes, it was going on, and even some very famous people like Charles Dickens went to those kinds of executions. Again, we don't know why Charles Dickens went. He talks about the behavior of the crowd being badly behaved, but it's also some kind of hint that he enjoyed it, or he thought it was a satisfying thing to do in some way, to go and watch that. He was a journalist, all right? He worked for a newspaper before he was a writer, and maybe it's his journalistic instinct that he wants to see the news, he wants to see something that's going to be in the newspapers. We don't really know, again, why he went, but he did, okay? So Charles Dickens had personally seen these kinds of things happening. I mentioned Dickens because he's such a famous writer from that time. But if you research other writers or other famous people, you'll find that some of them also went to these kinds of events. Now, this idea that punishment was a spectacle, a form of entertainment, it's got a long history. And again, if you were in my class last term, we talked a little bit about it then. So I'm going back here. It's a little bit of revision, or just covering some things that I talked about last term a bit. I start with a little village where my mother used to live. She died last year, but she lived in a little village just outside Brighton in Sussex. And I would sometimes go shopping for her. And when I went to the shops, I would walk past a little street called Whipping Post Lane. It was the name of the street. It still is the name of the street. Whipping Post Lane. And I would have a kind of sort of feeling as I walked past that, because now there is no whipping post there, but in some towns there are still whipping posts that are still standing there. Many of them were made of wood, so they rotted, and over time they just kind of either rotted to pieces or people took them down, took them away. But some of them were made of stone, like this one. And people would be tied to things like this and publicly whipped for some crime that they'd committed. And there used to be whipping posts like this in every village all up and down the country. And people would be, here you can see a man in the 17th century for his religion. Again, he was a Quaker. He was a strong form of Protestant, too strong for the Church of England. They didn't like these Quakers. They were too radical, too Protestant. And they tie him to the back of a wagon, and they pull the wagon through the town, and they just whip him all the way through the town. And then when they finish whipping him through the town, they tie him to a post and they cut his tongue out. So that was his punishment in the 17th century. And this sort of thing it continued until the 19th century. 1827 was the last time that the law allowed men and women to be beaten in public. So all through the time, for example, when you read Jane Austen's novels and you think of Jane Austen's world, you need to remember that although she's writing about elegant ladies meeting nice gentlemen and maybe not such nice ones and marrying them or not marrying them and all that kind of elegant life that Jane Austen writes about, it would be perfectly possible for somebody to be taken into the street publicly and whipped. And she doesn't write about that kind of thing, you see. But it's worth remembering that at the same time as she is writing about her elegant stories of kind of upper middle class society, this kind of thing was still going on. We've got beggars being whipped through the streets here again in the 16th century. Our society isn't very kind to homeless people, but when the monasteries, the Shodoin, were closed in the 16th century, the monasteries had given charity to poor people, and after the monasteries closed, there were a lot of poor people in the streets who weren't getting any kind of charitable help anymore from the Shodoin, which they, you know, the Obosang would give charity and look after them. When the monasteries were closed, they were just out on the streets. And what's the reaction? Oh, we'll just whip them through the town and make sure they don't come back here. So our society may not be very kind to homeless people now, but it was worse, a lot worse in those days. Here is something called a pillory. The stocks would trap your legs and you would not be able to move your feet, and people could come up and throw things at you, rotten eggs you hoped, stones if you were unlucky. Just passers-by could come and throw things at them. This one is made for 2 people and it's high up. It was probably when 2 people who were not married were found having sex together. Okay, especially if one of them was married to somebody else. And that would be the crime of adultery, sleeping with somebody else's husband, sleeping with somebody else's wife, and they would be forced to stand up there. This would open up, you see, and their head would go in the middle one, and their arms would go in the 2 side holes, and then it would be closed down again. They'd be trapped there. So all this kind of unpleasant stuff is something that was still carrying on, less and less, but still carrying on at the beginning of the 19th century. We still have these kinds of things happening. And if that wasn't enough, you could always, in the 16th or 17th century, or even into the 18th century, you could always watch the pleasant spectacle of animals being tortured. Queen Elizabeth, for example, would enjoy watching the bears fighting the dogs. And people would be betting, okay, how many dogs can the bear kill before the dogs overwhelm the bear and kill it. So watching human beings suffering didn't seem to be enough for some people. They enjoyed watching animals suffer as well. I think bear fighting was made illegal I don't have the exact dates there, I think sometime in the 18th century, but there was still dog fighting, cockfighting, various forms of, making animals hurt each other. So there's an awful lot of cruelty, and the cruelty was a kind of entertainment for people. Now, by the Victorian period, Queen Victoria, by the way, yes, the Victorian period is not the same as the 19th century. People often say the whole 19th century is the Victorian period. Queen Victoria became queen in 1837. So strictly speaking, the Victorian period is from 1837 to 1901, I think. I'm not very good on dates, but I think it's 1901 when that's Queen Victoria. And strictly speaking, when we talk about Victorian England, we should mean that period. Of course, she was born, I think, about 1820, but not the whole of the 19th century is the Victorian period. It's not the same. And people sometimes make that mistake. So basically, by the time Queen Victoria becomes queen, most of these kinds of entertainment do not exist anymore. The pillory was abolished in the same year as Queen Victoria became queen, 1837. The pillory was that one where they have something, we saw them high up. It doesn't have to be high up, but in that case it was high up, and they put their arms and their head are trapped. The stocks is the one that trapped their feet, and that was not actually formally abolished. It just slowly fell into disuse, and the last time it was employed was in 1872, and here's a picture of a man in the stocks in the 1860s. They were still doing this in the 1860s and into the 1870s. So here's an actual photograph of somebody in the stocks at that time. I think probably it would be, by this time, it would be, well, you can see the faces, he's kind of laughing. They're I think they're standing there more to protect the guy in a way. Probably that if you think you can come up and throw stones at him, no, we've gone past that, all right? But he has to sit there so that people can see him publicly. You did something bad, and so you have to publicly be made ashamed. But I don't think they would have been throwing things at them by this stage. But in the 16th, 17th centuries, yes, they would. All right, let's move on to the prison system. Prison was becoming more and more a way of punishing people. As I said, even in the 18th century, prison was still being seen mostly as a place where you wait before your punishment. It wasn't actually the punishment itself. And as the Victorian period continues, the streets are not the place where cruelty is acted out anymore. By the end of the Victorian period, that's not happening. So, from that point of view, the Victorian period is a step forward in the history of human progress, in the sense of certainly Britain and most parts of Europe turning their backs on public suffering in that kind of way. Even as a punishment for a crime, you have a right not to suffer the indignity of being exposed to people's eyes as you have your punishment given to you. But that's not just the whole story. There's more to say than that, because this growth in the way of using prison itself as a form of punishment had been slowly growing up during the 17th and 18th centuries, and now by the 19th century it was becoming the typical punishment, using prison itself as a punishment. And the conditions in the prisons were often very, very, very bad. They were damp, they were unhygienic. Prisoners would quite often die of disease. They were dirty places. Cold, damp, dirty places. And interestingly, if you were taken as a prisoner, you had to pay for all services you received in the prison, including food. So you were being charged as if you were in a hotel. If you couldn't pay the bill, you couldn't eat. So you can imagine people who've got no money at all, what's going to happen to them when they put them in prison? So there would be some charities that would try to help people like that, but very often such people would suffer very, very badly. And it's particularly ironic because one common reason for imprisonment was debt. We talked about Hogarth before. Do you remember his picture of the drunken people in the street? Here's another picture showing a debtor's prison. You owe money, you can't pay the money you owe. What do they do with you? They put you in prison. And it's a private prison because the person who wants the money employs somebody and says, look, this person owes me money, I've got this proof, you go and take that person and put them in prison for me. If it was a high-class person, they would just be locked into a comfortable room. It wouldn't be a big problem. But if it was a poor person, they would be locked up in a debtor's prison where the conditions were very often bad, and their whole family would have to move into the prison with them because they had nowhere else to go. But isn't it crazy? You can't pay the money you owe, so we put you in prison. But if I'm in prison, I can't work. I can't get the money to... That's your problem. Get your friends to help you, get your family to help you, get a rich uncle to pay the money, but if not, you stay here. I haven't got any rich uncles. I'm poor. Well, you're just going to have to stay here. So, a very typical form of punishment for owing money was to lock people up in a debtor's prison. Hello? Here we go. You see, privately, people would employ a bailiff. A bailiff was somebody, he wasn't a policeman, he wasn't an official, he was paid privately. If somebody owes you money, you go and find this official, you say, please, here's some money for you, and please go and get this person and put them in, collect the money for me, or put them in prison for me. So, really, at this stage, late 18th, early 19th century, there's no proper police force. The prisons would be privately owned, the conditions would be terribly bad for poor people, but upper class offenders would get very different kind of treatment. And again, this is something that was radically reformed during the course of the 19th century. For example, starting from 1815, the jailers, that's the British spelling, by the way, of jail, G-A-O-L. In American English, of course, it's always been J-A-I-L. And even in British English these days, they're starting to use the American spelling, which makes a lot more sense. I don't know where this British spelling came from, really. I don't know why jail was spelt like that, but the jailers, the people who looked after the prisoners, after 1815, they had to be paid by the state, not allowed to charge prisoners for their services. But before that, the prisoners would have to pay the jailers to get food or to get other privileges. After 1823, different types of prisoners were separated. Severe crimes, violent crimes, and so on, they would be separated from people who had committed smaller crimes, lesser crimes. And women prisoners had to be governed by female warders. Before this, women prisoners might be guarded by male warders. They might be sexually abused by those warders. There'd be nothing they could do about it. And if you are a prisoner who cooperates, then again, from 1823, they introduced the idea, well, if you cooperate, we don't punish you so badly. So good behavior. And prison inspections, people whose job it was to go and check that the conditions in the prison were good enough and that people weren't suffering from problems of hygiene or problems of shortage of food and so on, was introduced in 1835, 2 years before Queen Victoria actually became queen. So the 19th century is a time of reform of all kinds, and in the law we're seeing huge reforms. In the treatment of prisoners we're seeing huge reforms. And hello, what have we got here? Children started to be treated more and more differently from adults. The system of reform schools for children instead of prison. A juvenile means a young person. If a young person's committing crimes, instead of just putting them into prison, which should be like a kind of school for crime, the older prisoners would teach the children how to steal more effectively, how to be better at their crime. But instead of that, they would send them to a reform school where they would get some kind of education and they would be helped towards being kind of good members of society. At least that was the idea. In 1869, the law was changed, so you can't be put in prison just for owing money. So permanent debt, the laws relating to that change. Then you've got, in 1878, you've got the Prison Act. The worst prisons are closed and all prisons are brought under central governmental control. But some of the reforms, most of these reforms were helping the prisoner, making life better for prisoners, but not all of them. The Penal Servitude Act made conditions stricter and forced criminals to do hard work, labour. And the idea was to say, you won't just go to prison because it's comfortable and easy, and you can just sit there and people will bring you food. No, if you're in prison, you have to suffer punishments. The kind of punishment would be, for example, have you kept a hamster? Those little animals. People keep them and they put a kind of circle thing and they go in the middle. It goes round and round and round. Do you know what I'm talking about? So I should have a picture of it. They get in there and they can't run because they're inside the cage, but they can run inside that. And they kind of run along like that and they make it go round and round and round. Well, prisoners would be forced to walk on a mill like that. They couldn't go, it wasn't taking them anywhere, they weren't getting anywhere. Like, just do it. Just do it. 6 hours, 8 hours. Walk on it, walk on it. Comes into Oliver Twist, for example. They talk about it in Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist, walking on the mill. Some of those mills would be connected to a machine, so that it might be doing something like grinding flour for bread. Some of them were just for nothing, just do it because it's your punishment. So they had these kinds of hard work tasks, some of them for no meaning, like dig a hole and then fill it in again, and tomorrow dig the hole again and then fill it in again. It's just your punishment. And sorry, I had put in a kind of, this is a slightly different kind of mill, but can you see they walk here and they make this go round and round. So they're just keeping on walking and walking and walking, facing a wall here, and they just walk, 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 and they just have to do that for hours and hours and hours. So I've talked a few times about how people would be sent as an alternative to being put to death or having a prison sentence inside the country. They would be sent to the colonies, the shokuminchi. And transportation started really in the 17th century as an alternative to hanging. It comes into Moll Flanders. You remember we talked about Moll Flanders by Defoe. She gets sent to America as a convict. And it grew more and more popular during the 18th century because it was a way of getting cheap labour out to the colonies. Remember, they were using slavery, but also if they could get cheap criminal labour, that was another way to get workers out into those colonies, especially the ones that didn't have a large native population, like Australia or America. Of course, America became independent, but before it became independent. So up until it became independent, it was the most popular destination for convicts up until the American War of Independence. So after the 1780s, they weren't sent there anymore, and Australia became the typical destination. In Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, for example, Magwitch is sent as a convict to Australia. Now we're talking about 160,000 men, women and children who were sent to Australia over a period of about 80 years, from the later part of the 18th century and through the first half of the 19th century. And quite often the conditions were pretty harsh. Again, the life on a ship in those days, it would take several months to reach Australia. Very often they would run out of food, or fresh fruit or something like that would not be available. So they'd be just eating bread or something similar to that, with no vitamins and things, so they would get illnesses easily. And once they got there, they'd be forced into hard manual labour, and if they did not behave and cooperate, they would be punished very severely. They would be beaten and otherwise badly treated. And the ships would look something like that. And they would go all the way to Australia, taking several months on that kind of ship. During the late 18th century, the conditions were very poor and a lot of them died. During the 19th century, the situation got much better, and sometimes they would arrive in better condition than when they had started out. So increasingly, these ships would be stopping off at little ports and picking up supplies of fresh fruit and fresh vegetables. Very often they would arrive, well, I don't know very often, but sometimes they would arrive in better health than they were living on the streets of London or other cities in England or Britain, where they would be fighting for food and having difficulty getting a decent diet. During much of the Victorian period, especially the first half of the Victorian period or the early 19th century, food was actually quite a big problem for people. Just getting enough food to eat every day was a problem. You've got this country that's famous for its empire around the world, famous for its industrial revolution, and many of the ordinary people do not get enough to eat. We'll come back to that topic, I think, later on. 7 years was typical. After 7 years, they were going to be usually allowed to do whatever they wanted, including going home to their own, going back to Britain after the 7 years. Very often, though, they would say, now I'm free, I'm in Australia, this is a land of opportunity, I can become rich. And before that, the same would happen in America. They would stay because there were more opportunities in America or in Australia for them to make money, for them to get land, for them to live a respectable life where they didn't have to be stealing and doing criminal things anymore. And Magwitch, in Great Expectations, we first hear of him in Dickens's novel when he escapes from a hulk, a ruined ship that's being used as a prison. Very effective. If the ship itself is too old and can't be used as a ship anymore, they would put a kind of roof over the deck. They'd use it as a living space, a prison. No escape, unless you could swim very, very well, because they would be kept off the shore. And Magwitch has somehow managed to escape from a hulk like this, but typically during the 18th and 19th century, ruined ships were used as housing for prisoners. And he was chained in leg irons, Magwitch. I don't know exactly how he managed to escape with leg irons from the hulk. Maybe he managed to steal a boat or something that somehow float on something back to the shore. I don't know how he did it. Dickens doesn't explain that. But when he's taken to Australia, instead of the usual 7 years, he's sent for life. And even if he comes back, so even after his sentence finishes, if he comes back to Britain, he will be put to death. And that's exactly what he does. He comes back to Britain and they catch him. But he's so old and ill by this time that he dies before they can actually hang him. That was kind of unusual. The last person to be hanged for that crime was in 1810, and the law was changed in 1835. So mostly they'd be able to come back to Britain if they wanted to. But that's the sort of thing that you'd need to be very kind of clear about, because the fact that Magwitch could be hanged for coming back to the country tells us when Dickens's novel is set. You see, the novel was written in 1860 to 61, but it talks about a crime that ended in 1835. So we know that although the novel is written later on, it's writing about an earlier time. And one of the reasons we know it is because we know our history. If we didn't know our history, we might think that the story was happening much later on at the time that the novel was being written. You've got to be really careful about that sort of thing when you're looking at 19th century novels, or any novel really. When exactly was it written, and when is the period that it was written about? Many novels of that time are written about an earlier period. Same would be true of, for example, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. She writes it later on in the 19th century, but the story itself happens in the early part, the beginning of the 19th century. The laws were different, the conditions were different, and we need to be awake to those kinds of differences. So I'm going to introduce a theory here that's quite an interesting one. We might have a little bit of time at the end to look at the theory, or the man who makes the theory. So it starts with something called the civilizing process. And what is happening on this planet? Are things getting better generally? Are things getting worse? I mean, looking at what we've seen today, you're probably thinking, God, it was horrible back then. People were being punished in the streets, people were being whipped, people were being put to death just for stealing a small thing. And it's true, isn't it? We don't have that now. Not in Japan, not in Britain, not in many countries of the world. So sometimes we turn on the television and we hear bad news and we think, oh, everything's getting worse in life. You know, problems, problems, problems. But in a lot of ways, things are getting better. And the civilizing process is a positive theory of what's happening in this world at the moment. We're getting more civilized. The world is getting more gentle. We live for longer than 100 years ago, where most of us rather taller than we were 100 years ago because we get a better diet. Our chances of being killed are, well, maybe this morning isn't a very good morning for having that conversation with another missile being sent from North Korea today. But in general, our chances of being killed by other human beings are much lower than they were in the past. And this is called the civilizing process. So this move away from corporal punishments, it can be seen in different ways. We don't have whipping in public, or whipping at all, really. It's not a punishment that it's not inside the law. The decline of the death penalty. One way of looking at it is Steven Pinker's way of looking at it. You can find him easily on YouTube. He's got a very famous TED talk on YouTube. The idea that human beings have become gradually less violent as they become more civilized. And against that, there's the argument that what they call civilized societies are just as cruel as other societies, but they hide their cruelty out of sight. So when you look at Victorian England, on the one hand, you can see this decline in public punishment. People are no longer being put out onto the streets and whipped or hanged or those sorts of things. But at the same time, there's a huge rise in the use of prisons and transportation to penal colonies. Punish them, but out of our sight. Whereas before, the idea was punish them where we can see them being punished. Now it's punish them, but we don't want to see them. Keep it out of our face. So, depending on how you look at it, you could say, well, we're getting more civilized, or you could just say we're getting more, I don't know, sensitive in a way that's maybe not so good. I mean, when I was a little boy, when we wanted meat, we went to the meat shop and there would be a pig right there on a hook, a pig. Okay, you want some pig? Here, I'll cut you some pig. Okay, you can still go out. The last time this happened to me was in Morocco. All right, it's still like that there. There it is, a sheep. The animal is there and they cut it. Which bit do you want? They cut it off. Now we go to the supermarket and it's wrapped in plastic and we don't think it's an animal at all. All right? Is that better? Or is it just more hypocritical? We don't really want to talk about actually an animal died so that you can have bacon for breakfast. I mean, I like bacon. I can't help it. But you know, are we just less honest, or are we really getting better? And that's the kind of question that it's not just looking at the facts of history, it's how do we understand those facts? How do we think about what's happening? Okay? So, Pinker has got an interesting theory, and there are other people who are disagreeing with him about it. It's a good kind of topic for a term paper, if you want to write about something like that. Okay. The police. I said that at the beginning of the 19th century there was no police force. And basically there wasn't. If you were the victim of some crime in the 18th century, and the early 19th century, you would have to get support yourself. You're the person, well, they did it to you. You have to catch the criminal, or you have to get people to help you to catch the criminal. There was no special force for doing it. The bailiffs would help if it was an economic thing, but the person who had to catch and prosecute the criminal was usually the victim of the crime, helped by friends, or there would be unpaid constables employed by the parish in some clear cases, but there wasn't an organised police force. The person who was accused of the crime would be brought before a magistrate in a court, and they would decide whether, there really was worth carrying on and calling this a crime. And it wasn't until 1829 that we got the first police force. And it wasn't until 1856 that it actually became a national police force all over the country. So, although laws were very strict, the system for enforcing the laws was rather chaotic from our way of thinking. There wasn't a police force that was organised to do the job of catching people who didn't break the law. It was very much the responsibility of the victim to catch the person who had done them some crime. If you were rich, obviously you'd have a lot more chances of catching somebody because you could employ other people. I'll pay you to help. If you were poor, very often you just had to suffer because you couldn't do anything about it. This is the early police force. They were set up by a politician called Robert Peel, and first of all they were given the nickname Peelers, okay, from Robert Peel, but then they were given the name Bobby for Robert. But the short form of Robert is Bob, and they were called Bobbies. And people still sometimes use that word Bobby to talk about a policeman. It's a kind of Horgan word for a policeman. It's a bit old-fashioned now, but you still sometimes hear it, the Bobby. And this is the National Police Force as it was set up in the 1860s. I explained that they were popularly called Bobbies by the middle of the 19th century. Well, it did make a big difference having a professional police force, but here you can see something horrific going on. You can see two little children, two little boys who stole pigeons. Okay, hato. They stole somebody's pigeons, and it comes into the newspaper. The policeman's holding them down while, I'm not sure exactly who it is who's beating them, but the police are cooperating in the physical punishment of small children here. And this was something that was going on in Yorkshire in 1877, and it was put in the newspaper, of children being flogged. I think by this time, society is kind of dividing itself. There's some people who believe that this kind of punishment is right and should be done, and you can see the police actually cooperating here with a person, small children being severely beaten. And when it's put into the newspaper, it's going to cause a scandal, because a lot of other people are saying, wait a minute, we don't think this is right. This isn't what we should be doing. You see? So, in fact, by this stage, public punishment is supposed to be illegal. So this is just going on behind a closed door. It's not being done out in the street, but it's still happening. It's still going on. But public feeling is we shouldn't be doing this. And so it was a scandal. Come on. So these kinds of punishments would lead to protests, and the protests would lead to reform. And as I keep on saying, if there's one thing you really need to understand about the Victorian period, it's the fact that things are changing over the century. If this had happened 50 years before, the majority of the society might be saying, quite right too. They must be taught to obey and not to steal. But by the 1870s, this is happening, it gets into the newspapers, it's a scandal. So I think if there's one thing about today's lesson that we really need to think about carefully, it's the fact that things are changing over the course of the 19th century. In this area and in many, many other areas. It's a century of reform. If you want to know more about Victorian crime, there's a Victorian Crime and Punishment website that is excellent. It's got all sorts of details and information. It'll tell you a lot more than I've got time to tell you. All right, so if you want to find out a bit more, please go there. Okay, well that's it for this presentation.